Good afternoon, happy Monday, and thank you for joining us. My name is Josiah Gilliam, and I'm the My Brother's Keeper coordinator for Mayor Bill Peduto, and we've been doing a series of conversations around realities related to COVID and equity and progress and policy. And we have a special opportunity today to have a conversation with some team members in the Office of Equity and in the Mayor's office, and some council members for Pittsburgh City Council. And I'm really looking forward to the chance to chat with them and also to learn. So without further ado, let's just jump right in and start with introductions. For those of us on the call here, can you just start with your name, your title, and how you share what you do through your role? And we'll start with Councilman Ricky Burgess.
Hello, I'm Councilman Ricky Burgess. I serve as a representative for District 9, and I am intently concerned about both police reform and economic and community development in African American communities.
Thank you, sir. Councilman Lavelle.
My name is Daniel Lavelle. Excuse me. I serve representing City Council District 6, which includes parts of Oakland, Hill District, downtown, and the North Side. And equal to Councilman Burgess, I share many of his concerns, but the overall state of affairs for African Americans as well.
I appreciate that. Deputy Chief Lane.
Thank you, Deputy Chief of Staff and Chief Equity Officer. In that context, again, really looking at all populations in our city and trying to be thoughtful and think about what it looks like to really have equity and fairness and opportunity for every citizen of our city, and not just a few.
Thank you, sir. And Chief Powell.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Powell. I serve as the Assistant Chief of Staff, and largely my work includes running the Legislative and Policy Shop. So essentially, all of the things that the councilman and the Chief Equity Officer talked about, how we make that happen through legislation and policy.
Thank you so much. So Majestic and Lindsay, I'd like to start it with you. And before we get into the meat of the call, how are you two doing? It's been a while since we've all been on a call and checked in. How are things going with you two?
So I'll start, and I'm sure Chief Powell will add on. I'm, doing well as can, all things considered during this time. I mean, obviously we're in a time of just intense change, not just in our city, but all across the country and all across the world, frankly. And it's just really thinking about how, do you take the energy and so much of the effort and so much of the vision that people have right now for this time of change, and how do you institutionalize it? How do you make sure that it's long-standing change? How do you make sure that it's not a blip on the long arc of history, but yet a transition to a new place in the arc of history? So, but just acknowledging that many of the challenges we're seeing are all symptoms of a larger issue.
Thank you. Chief Powell, how are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Chief Lane put it together beautifully. I think that a lot of us in the policy space are overwhelmed, but overjoyed by a lot of the energy that's going into thinking about how do we shift to a quote unquote new normal? How do we ensure that a lot of the values and interests that have been stated already on this call are upheld through longstanding policy? So we have a lot of work to do ahead of us, but I'm cautiously optimistic.
So let's keep it with this idea, of policy. Can you speak as far as the Peduto administration? What has the team been focused on, and what should we keep in mind for the conversation today? You mentioned that there's this interesting blend here where, especially when it comes to policy, there have been things that have been in the works and in progress for some time, and yet now we're in this moment too with increased enthusiasm and attention, and some specific actions taking place. Can you speak a little bit to that, and then that'll help us frame the rest of the conversation?
I'll leave that to Chief Powell. She's
Sure. No, I was going to say, I think good policy, lasting policy, has a few tenets. Obviously being intentional about the outcomes that you want to see, but also understanding the moment that you're in. Oftentimes, especially in our highly politicized world, within the policy space, you push as much as you can. So in this climate, maybe we'll push a piece of legislation this way, even though the goal is much further. And so currently, with a lot of the conversations that are happening, particularly on how to bring racial equity, policy to the forefront, how do we support Black neighbors and communities? How do we shift the conversation to thinking about not just, how do we get what we can, but how do we get what we want and need? I'm very grateful that within the administration, we have some very thoughtful policy folks who are trying to, again, uplift a lot of the energy that we've seen out in the community into lasting policy that will move towards change.
I appreciate that. So one of the things the mayor had accepted was the MBK challenge related to police reform, and then recently the announcement of a task force specifically geared in this direction that's going to provide recommendations on what seems like an accelerated timeframe this fall, really getting back with some actionable items. What else has the administration been focused on, and what's rolling out in the coming days and weeks?
Well, I would also add, you can also add that the mayor has agreed to adopt the 8 Can't Wait model. Has come from Campaign Zero. We're looking at the development of the Office of Community Health and Safety that really looks to, acknowledge that often in our modern day, body politic, police are asked to do a lot of things and serve a lot of other purposes. And because of those things, you get a lot of sometimes negative impacts from that. So we've really been trying to be thoughtful around what are the roles of community health and community safety that we know can be a collaboration between the Office of Equity and Public Safety in order to work on some of the things that we know do work and shine and pay some more attention to that and kind of focus that, and also have that office be an office that connects with DHS, the state and other parties, really to think about this idea of what does community health look like? How do we reduce proximity violence? How do we deal with situations with people with no addresses? How are we dealing with the opioid epidemic? And how are we supporting and growing alongside police to be able to work on those kind of things and really kind of set a new state for how we're going to engage and how we're going to serve all of our citizens, and not serve all of our citizens in a very one-size-fits-all context, which we see there are just a lot of negative externalities that come from, that mentality. So it's really about doing things on a variety of different levels. There's programmatic challenge, there's programmatic investments. Recently, we've invested another $100,000 around our group violence intervention work to kind of complement some of the work that Councilman Lavelle and Councilman Burge did late last year. So we know that it takes it takes a level of coordination. A lot of people think of things as a silver bullet. And, when you're looking at the total life, the quality of life for our residents, there's no silver bullet. All these things are interconnected. And so, what you'll hear today and what you see today is even how, the mayor's office interacts with council people who share interest in working on things that are important to all of the residents. And so you'll hear talk about the public racism and public health commission, to talk about some of the racial equity work that Councilman Lavelle and Councilman Burgess have been doing. But these are all things that are connected, that we are all working together on, because we do acknowledge that it takes all of us and all the people, not just in city government, but then also in state government and federal government, to deal with issues that, let's be clear, are global phenomena. Racism and white supremacy, those are global phenomena. Those are not local phenomena. They have a focus of local activity as it pertains to individuals' lives. But these are broad things. These are broad interlocking systems that have co-conspired to harm. And so we have to think about how do we create systems that co-conspire to heal and to help. And that's easier said than done, but that's the process of thinking about the relationship of policy, programmatics, and procedural changes and shifts that we're doing within the administration.
Thank you. So it's fascinating because even in the past calendar year, and it's great that we have the council people here with us today to speak to some of this, because on a policy and public health standpoint, they've been some of the most visible forward-facing leaders speaking about these issues. But if you were to ask me and like the MBK work about work related to law enforcement, I would have pointed to the public health framing around violence prevention and intervention as a really good example of where law enforcement and the community have been working together, and where resources have been deployed to not just activate, not just engage, but to pay community members to do that kind of work. And we were seeing what I felt was tremendous results in the numbers, and now we have this moment of increased attention, and it's fascinating to consider what more might be done. I'd like to pivot to the council people now. Councilman Burgess, Reverend Burgess, thank you for being here, sir. Before we get into the meat of the policy stuff and how the sausage gets made, happy Father's Day to you. And I just wondered and I would just wonder how you've been doing and what's been on your mind recently at this. I would say is probably a pretty unprecedented time, even in your tenure.
Well, certainly, COVID-19 has disproportionately affected people of color and community of color. The most disadvantaged group is African Americans over 70. And as a pastor, I have been, just focused on trying to keep members of my church and certainly members of my family safe and practicing social distance. I do think that we need to acknowledge at this moment, but I am acutely aware of that this is the moment to talk about race. We have used buzzwords, equity, inclusion, we use all these words, but in Pittsburgh, the reality is there is primarily two groups of people. There are the majority culture and there are African Americans, right? And I am completely convinced that it's now a time to talk specifically about racial equity and about investing in the places that African Americans live. And I believe that it is time for us to prioritize the African American community. And it's very simple to me that we ought to build African American communities for African Americans, by African Americans, with our allies and partners. And that's the real, I think we need a place-based strategy and we need to focus, although we'll be doing lots of policy stuff. It's really when we are willing to invest in our communities at scale with all of the things it needs. As long as we have these communities of Pittsburgh, which are segregated and isolated poverty, communities of concentrated poverty rather, things will not get better. And so you're going to hear me, although I am still really interested in police reform, I'm really interested in equity work, I'm really interested in how we change city government, but you're also going to hear me challenge both city government and all stakeholders to now pivot to a place-based strategy to begin to, in a tangible way, a tangible manifestation of our commitment will be the rebuilding of the Hill District, the rebuilding of Homewood, the rebuilding of Belsuva, the rebuilding of the north side of Manchester. And when we do that, then we can begin to talk about our real commitment and how we have shown that in the targeting of resources to those communities.
Anyone that has a chance to encounter your work, sir, will get a strong sense of the importance you place on place-based solutions. I wonder, for those who do not know, if you could share a little bit about your history and how you got involved with local government in the beginning.
Well, I have pastored a church 1 block from where I was born and raised for the last 36 years. I have been a professor at our local community college, including 2 blocks from where I was born and raised, right? For the last 30 years. I married a girl who I met in 1st grade, who was 4 blocks from where I was raised and lived. And so I've spent my entire, and I live 2 blocks from where I was born right now. And so I've spent my entire life in one community trying to make a difference. And what happened was that I was pastoring in the midst of the crack epidemic, in the midst of gang violence. And I tried in doing social work in addition to teaching to make a difference. And I realized that I was not doing enough. And so I came to council with really 2 priorities that I have kept. One is I wanted to stop violence. We brought, as you know, the Group Violence Initiative stuff, it was then called PERC, to Pittsburgh, and was its leader to get it implemented, and it did as it would we knew it would do. It reduced the number of homicides, and in part. And then second of all, I have been, actively concerned about rebuilding Black communities. That you cannot just, you can't just create change on a broad base, but you must zero down to concentrate on these communities of isolated poverty and transform them into mixed income neighborhoods. And how do we do that? And then the last thing, my work has been trying to then coordinate all available resources so that we're not just building houses, but we're building houses and we're changing schools and we're changing educational outcome. We're providing social services, we're providing amenities, we're doing job training, we're doing African-American entrepreneurship. All those things must be done at the same time at scale. And so I've been trying to create showcase communities, priority communities, select communities in the city that are the first wave of this work. And Larimer, of course, is our best example. We think Homewood is next up for my district. And then over time to rebuild African-American communities throughout the city of Pittsburgh.
Thank you, sir. You're also someone that served on council for some time. And how do you, if you were explaining the work of city council to a group of youth in your district, how do you explain what the city council is and what their role is?
Well, at this point, I think I am the longest serving African-American member of council in its history. I'm pretty sure I am. And so I think council does three things. One, council does legislative stuff, right? We write laws, we pass budgets, we oversee the city budget through a period of laws. So we write laws and we oversee the budget. That's like the first bucket. The second budget is we do what's called constituent concerns. That is, if you have a problem at home, an individual person, they call us, and they call us to get their streets paved, or they call us because a tree has fell down, or Public Works needs to come and shovel snow. So the second thing we do is constituent concerns and answer their questions and act like advocates for them individually. But then the third thing we do, and I probably tend to do more of this than other members of council, is we become advocates for our community. We become, in many ways, its leaders to advocate for change or for what our communities need. We can do that advocation just in government, but we, I think, to be effective, have to do that on the state, as Majestic, I think, eloquently put. It takes coordination of resources from the local government and county government and state government and federal government and the private sector. And so those are the three things that I think we do. We legislate, one, we act as helpers in doing constituent concerns. But then the third thing, we act as advocates, as public advocates for the good for the communities we represent, in specifically, but in general, at least I think Lavelle and I, and for Councilman Lavelle and I, we view ourselves as the spokesman for the African American community, who, even if they are not in our district, they are usually not a priority of the council people who represent them. And so we take them on also as part of our advocacy.
So let's just keep it with your district very briefly. Let's place it for folks. What neighborhoods are we speaking? You mentioned Homewood and Larimer. What neighborhoods are we talking about with your district in particular?
Basically, I represent from Garfield to East Hills. And so I represent Garfield, Homewood, East Liberty, Lincoln, Leamington, Larimer, parts of Point Breeze, half of Staten Heights, a little part of Friendship. And I think that's all of the districts. And Park Place would be the last one. And so east, I am the most east of the council districts, and I represent the largest group of African Americans.
All right, thank you very much. Councilman Lavelle, let's turn to you, sir. Happy belated Father's Day to you as well. How are you doing with the recent several weeks and also the realities of COVID-19 for the past several months?
Thank you. All things considered, I'm doing relatively well. My biggest challenge, well, one of my biggest challenges has been, I have two young children, 7 and 9. And so amidst this pandemic, school shut down, obviously, how to keep them active, how to keep educating them, how to make sure they get some time outside. That's sort of been a personal challenge. And then you obviously have all the unrest and calls for social justice that we've now seen. And again, sort of on a personal level, how to have that conversation with my two children who on a weekly basis are seeing things on the news and asking, why is this Black man dying and why is this Black man being choked, and trying to reconcile with that. And so these are interesting times, but I think sort of as Director Powell said, I'm also optimistic because we now see specifically our white allies taking to the streets and realizing that we need change, and these are times where we can actually have an impact. And so amidst this crisis, we have an actual opportunity to do some good. And so for those reasons, I'm excited.
Thank you, sir. Would you mind sharing a little bit about your history and how you came to be involved with local government?
Sure. It was actually Representative Wheatley. So I was actually living in Ohio at the time. I left Pittsburgh in 1995 to go away to college. At that time, I actually said I would probably never return, and was about 2 months from going to Florida State for graduate works. And I was living in Ohio. And Representative Wheatley knew of my interest in government and gave me a call and said, hey, would you be interested in coming back to Pittsburgh to potentially work for a city councilman? At that time, it was Salu Dean. And so I said, sure, I'll take a chance at it. So drove home, did an interviewed with him a couple of times, and ultimately he offered me the position. So instead of going to graduate school in Florida, I packed up my bags and moved back to Pittsburgh, and then worked for Sala for a while. Eventually went to work for State Representative Jake Wheatley, and then eventually sort of he didn't know he was giving me advice, but at the advice of my grandfather, I ultimately decided to run for office.
Got it. And how would you answer the same question I posed to Reverend Burgess? If you were speaking to a group of mentees or like school kids, how would you describe the work of city council and what you do there?
So every so often I'm asked to come into a school to talk to kids about what my job is and what we do. And for the most part, they're clueless and they don't see any value in local government. And so I'll often ask them, do you know who the president is? And of course, they know who the president is. And I'll sort of say, well, I may have a greater impact on your life than he will. And they don't see any rationale behind that until I ask them, tell me something you like to do, whatever that is. And it may be basketball, maybe I like to listen to music, whatever example they give me. And so I say, well, now I'm gonna make a law that says you're not allowed to play basketball anytime between 12 and 6. And they'll say, you can't do that. I say, absolutely, I can, assuming I can get the vote of my colleagues to do that. And so that's sort of an easy way for a child to understand the role that government has and the impact we can have, be it good or negative, on their life.
I appreciate that. Please don't make that law. That would be personally grievous to me as a basketball fan and player. But it's a good illustration. So just root us spatially very quickly. When we mention your districts, what neighborhoods are we referring to for folks?
So I start in Oakland, and then I come through the Hill District, uptown, downtown, I cross over to the north side, Manchester, Central North Side, California Kirkbride, Perry Hilltop, Marshall, and Manchester.
Got it. So the question for both of you, council people, and this has been mentioned already a little bit, and in other places around the nation and around the world, there's been an outsized impact of COVID-19 on poor populations, communities of color, Black populations, and African-American populations. We've been very concerned about that here in the city and the region. And even though we've had a relatively mild COVID-19 experience up until now compared to other municipalities that we see in the nation, we still see some of the disparities emerging when we take a look at rates stratified by race. You two represent, I believe, a majority of the African Americans between the two of you in the city. What has the experience been like for your communities? And could you speak to some of the racial realities as well from your perspectives?
So I'll begin. So toward your point, we absolutely know that there's a disparity between the African American community and the rest of those who are being affected. Early on, we saw the numbers in Detroit and Minneapolis and other places where you could see the extreme despair between those being affected. African Americans dying at alarming rates because of underlying issues that COVID is affecting. And so working with my colleague, Reverend Burgess, we did put together legislation to put together a task force to deal with racial inequalities related to COVID and how we respond to it. We will work with Director Powell and Director Lane on that, and the administration on how we follow through with that. But there is grave concerns. I continue to remind people that we are still in this pandemic despite our low numbers. On a personal note, my mother-in-law caught it, my sister caught it. So I know this is very real, and so I try to remind people that it is, and take it as seriously as possible. But what we've also seen is, unfortunately, this has simply highlighted what we all knew, that because of racism, because of historic inequities, that this was now having a disproportionate impact on the African American community. But towards the idea of how do we make some good out of this, I also think we now have the opportunity to say, as we come out of this, how do we do so in a way that directs resources to those communities most affected? How do we make sure that they're the ones being put back to work? How do we turn them into contact tracers? What are the economic opportunities that may exist? What are the fields where people actually need to be employed? And how do we work with them to gain better jobs as they come back out of this? So I think there's an opportunity to have some good come of this tragedy.
Thank you. Reverend?
Well, this week we were able to dedicate a new mobile testing unit at Alma Ilri in Homewood. Highmark bought a new mobile vehicle, and it is in Homewood all day, Tuesdays and Thursdays. And so in many ways, we are now focusing on the health of African Americans, but that health is not just physical health. It is financial health. It is living health. And so I want to, and I will sound somewhat like a broken record, if we're going to talk about race in Pittsburgh, there is a scholar who just retired from Harvard, who talks about the great American city, Dr. Wilson, and in his work, he talks about that the real way you can look at America is the chief way you determine someone's future is by their zip code. If you grow up in a certain area, you are more likely to be determined by that zip code than any single factor, even including education. A person with an undergraduate degree who was born in Homewood is going to have less success than someone without a degree that, for instance, was born in Shadyside, because they will have the informal network and all those other things. And so we need to now begin to take seriously redoing place-based interventions and making that a priority. One of the reasons that we haven't done it is because it's expensive. And we are, too often we are allocating money to combat those communities in negative ways, whether it's public safety budget or whether it is giving monies to sports teams, or all variety of ways that we allocate money to things outside those communities. We also give money to organizations that are not endemic, that are not inherent to those communities. So not only must we put money in rebuilding those communities, we have to build the capacity of those communities to equally participate. And so it becomes really important to me now, after the COVID virus, and it has disproportionately affected people of color and disproportionately affected community of colors. Now let's have a serious policy conversation about how we begin to change the nature of our government so it begins to focus on African Americans in African American communities to provide them in scale with the resources. Now we know what it looks like. Lomer, I believe, is an example of what the future of Pittsburgh can look like. It's mixed income housing. It has some of the highest educational levels. It has, those residents have access to jobs. They have amenities. They can walk to Trader Joe's and Whole Foods and gas stations and grocery stores and drugstores, where if you live in Homewood, there is no drugstore. There's only one gas station on the last block of that community. There's no fresh food stores. There's no chain stores. There's no restaurants, fast food restaurants. And so there's no amenities. And that is not accidental. That is the result of systematic institutional racism. And so if we're serious, that we've now said it exists, and now if we're serious about combating that, we as a city will provide the resources through our partners, local, state, and federal government. to now rebuild those communities, put back the amenities that those residents deserve. And I am on a mission to make that a reality.
Can we unpack a little bit the example of Larmer that you raised, sir? I do think it's an excellent example for folks to consider in a number of ways. This is a small neighborhood right next to Homewood that has about 1,750, maybe 1,800 people max in it. But they've been extraordinarily successful from a community organization standpoint, community leadership standpoint, policy and development standpoint. Can you just speak about how all this has come to be? Because it's not just been a matter of a policy change. There's been a lot of community activity.
Well, there is an organization that I think explains the process. We took the process and embedded it in something called the HELP Initiative. So if you're watching this live, if you go to helppgh.org, you'll find these principles. Okay, the first thing is to do community collaboration, right? You have to come together. And that community under the Larmer Consensus Group came together and drafted an idea, which became a vision plan of what they wanted the community to look like. And so that's the second thing, collaboration, and then to build a vision. The residents themselves build a vision of what they wanted their community to look like, right? The third of all, then you put capacity in local organizations. And so they got to participate, and then you find the capital. In this case, we got a federal grant from HUD, a HUD choice grant to build 300 houses in that neighborhood along with the amenities. So it's not just housing, but we also invested in amenities, a brand new park. It's also going to become one of the most ecologically friendly neighborhoods in the city. The also is you want to build closest to strength. You don't want to build in the heart of the community. You want to build on its fringes, closest to amenities. And so with 4 phases, it's about 300 homes, and those residents are moving into a mixed income neighborhood. For the first time now in about 50 years, there's the private market in Larmer. We put this public investment, now you have private investment. You have people redoing houses in Larmer without any public subsidy. And that sort of shows you've been successful. At the end of the day, what you want is a mixed income community. So the last thing is the new housing in Larmer is not all low income. It's 1/3 low income, 1/3 working income, and 1/3 market rate. And so you intentionally put people who may be paying rents of $25 next to people who are paying rents of maybe $500 next to people who are paying rents of $1,000. And we found out that when you put them together, their outcomes will be very similar. They will all succeed. And so that's, I think, the heart of how Black communities can reinvent themselves is strategically invest in their edges closest to strength at scale, providing them with new housing and all the amenities they need to be successful. And so that's really my mission. And Larmer is the example that we built the HELP Initiative of, but we've been now doing that model in the communities in 5 of the 7 or 8 communities I represent.
Yeah, I find myself pointing to Larmer fairly often when I talk about community work. When I worked at the Home of Children's Village, that was really my first introduction to some of the community leaders that you know well, Reverend, in the community. And I remember very distinctly, I was at this meeting at the Kingsley Association. It's kind of a large community center and athletic facility there with a long, proud history worth looking up, as well as a Larmer Consensus Group worth looking up for folks to get an idea of how this has unfolded. And the conversation was around green infrastructure. And they had a number of hydrologists there and professionals in that space to talk about gray water reuse and cisterns and these principles that I had started to learn through my time at the village, because we were looking at other kinds of projects in Homewood, and I was just learning a lot about it. And I was astonished because you had all these experts there in this meeting in Larmer, and they didn't say a word. It was the residents themselves that got up and spoke chapter and verse, so to speak, with specificity and detail about how they had installed, a cistern at their house and had been able to use it to reduce their monthly bills and had used it for a garden. Here's pictures of the garden. We've been learning about this. And it just really impressed upon me this idea that the leader I was working with at the time, Fred Brown, talked about, this idea of raising the IQ of a community around issues. And it was honoring them as the subject matter experts as they learned over time. And it was a truly profound experience for me. And they did a lot of great stuff there. And as you point out, Reverend, they're not in phase 1, are they? They've moved quite along here.
Yeah, they're now in phase 3. They've done the first 2 phases, and now the next 2 phases will be in the heart of Larmer to redo Larmer School and the block around Larmer School. And so we're still doing the work, but it is I think the first fruits, the first tangible fruit to see what can happen when a community comes together and the city brings all the resources to bear at scale. I think you're seeing something similar in Homewood. I think Homewood becomes the next great opportunity on the east side to build a new business district. We have the plans to build a brand new business district and housing down Homewood Avenue, connecting it to North Point Breeze. And I think that would perhaps be, in my opinion, those 2 things. If we are able to finish the project that we're working in the North Point Breeze corridor and connect them seamlessly with the busway to the Homewood priority development activities. So someone gets on the busway, whether they go up the North Point Breeze or down the Homewood, they see the same level of investment, the same level of new housing, and the same level of energy. I think that will become a newer vision of what's possible in the city of Pittsburgh.
I appreciate that. I'd like to get back to the policy here. Just one quick question about your respective districts. Anecdotally, in my experience, and I was having some conversations with colleagues in different sectors in our foundation community and like neighborhood level. And what they were experiencing, what I've experienced, is that it seems like folks are communicating more with like inter-community and intra-community. There's more check-ins that are taking place. Folks are reaching out proactively to hear how they might be able to get involved, trying to figure out what basic needs are, how to meet gaps and stuff like that. Are you all feeling, compared to other times in your history, that the community is a little bit more connected these days? And has there been a chance for those those communications to take place at a higher level?
In many respects, I think that has been the case. I can tell you in the Hill District, there's a weekly call on Mondays, actually, where all stakeholders just sort of get on a call to check in, whether it's a social service provider, whether it's Kirk Holbrook over at Pitt, whether it's Macedonia Face, myself, and just local residents to check in to say, who needs assistance? This individual is in need of some extra meals this week. We have this opening up. And so the crisis sort of created a situation where people actually had to come together to check in on one another to figure out who needs what assistance can be provided. And so it's become a really wonderful tool for our community.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing in part is also a switch to using the medium, right? In the Black church, there's always this informal communication, right? My members, and in the Black community, there's always been an informal communication. Well, we've not been able to gather at barbershops. We've not been able to gather in church. So we've not been able to hook into that informal network. And so now, for the first time, you have the majority of the Black community now using Facebook and Zoom and Twitter in order to, and media in order to get information. And so I think what you're seeing is a new emphasis, which I don't think will go away after this, on social media using Zoom and Facebook and YouTube and those devices that, the heart of African Americans probably until now did not utilize. But I think now that you're seeing them utilize it out of necessity.
So let's talk about policy. You guys mentioned that you all in City Council has addressed racism as a public health crisis. And you were also involved with the Stop the Violence initiative last year, which takes a focus on violence prevention and intervention work, again, through a public health lens. Can you speak about this, about these 2 initiatives and the public health framing especially? Councilman Burgess, you mentioned that earlier in your career, you'd seen this work and had helped institute it here in Pittsburgh, but this public health framing and the connection seems to be a bit of a new element to the conversation. Can we speak about why that framing is so important and then why it's important to specifically name racism?
You want me to start? You want Councilman Lavelle to start? Let me just start to say that the public health dimension of violence has always been to those of us who do the work. There is, in fact, a violence prevention model that is being utilized by the Operation Better Block that the city the mayor's office just invested in that actually use that public health model. It's been around a long time. I think what's changed is our understanding that racism itself is a public health crisis, that the violence we have is a subsection of the institutional racism. The problem is not just that people are violent, but that the structure of our economy, the structure of our society is delivered in a way to give unequal outcomes to people of color. And because of those unequal outcomes, that then leads them to these acts of desperation. And so if we are going to now stop violence, we cannot do it in isolation. We have to also stop the underlying conditions that cause the violence, the lack of resources, the lack of investment, the lack of quality education, the lack of economic opportunity, the lack of affordable housing. And so what you're seeing now, I think more clearly, is us working in concert with the other resources necessary to make violence go away. And I think we've been successful, but we need to continue to do more. And hopefully, as we've heard from our constituents, they want to see more resources given to the prevention effort. I can talk about this a lot. I think about this stuff every day. There are, these ways of stopping, of making change in terms of violence. There are prevention, intervention, police, prosecution, incarceration, and reintegration. So we've put over the last 20 years, the bulk of the money, 90% of the money, into policing, into prosecution, and in incarceration. We put 90% of the money in that area. We have not put the money into prevention, intervention, and reintegration. And so what I think has to happen is that has to be flipped. Over time, you have to start seeing more of the resources going, because what you invest in is what you prioritize, right? If you prioritize policing, you're going to see more arrests. If you prioritize incarceration, you'll see more jails and more people in jails, right? But if you put money into prevention, intervention, and reintegration programs, then you'll see that have its impact where you'll have less arrests, less problems. And that's really the challenge, to now, over time, figure out collectively how we can move resources from that draconian sort of punishment model into a prevention intervention model. And I think at the heart of the protest, that's really what they're trying to say. They don't necessarily do policy or articulate it that way, but that is the impact of what they are protesting, is for us to change our model of how we deal with violence, specifically with African Americans in general.
Yes, this is, and Councilman LaBelle, I'd like you to weigh in here as well, and Majestic and Lindsay too. This is, I think, an important point to stick with, because when you introduce this public health framing, it starts to clear up how, from a sense of priority, to your point, Reverend, resources and funding can be diverted or increased in other ways. And if you are, and you said the word persecution, meaning prosecution, but I think that term is apt, sir, because I think in many ways, these systems have been persecuting folks.
Yes.
Persecuting communities of color, persecuting poorer communities, what have you. And the public health conversation allows us to have this transition in our thought of how we move from systems that persecute to systems that provide care. And not just themselves, but in the other ecosystem of organizations and services, mental health training, of basic needs that can be brought to bear to care for folks, and to take a different frame to it altogether. Councilman LaBelle, what are your thoughts here, on these systemic thinkings and the public health, racism as public health work that you've been involved with?
So I want to pick up a point. We talk about the prevention as opposed to the persecution or the prosecution of our community. I had a conversation with one of our commanders, Commander Ragland on the North Side, and he gave me an example of when we talk about defunding the police and how to begin changing this around. He told me that at least once a week, if not more, the Zone 1 police station will get a call about coming to a home to address an unruly child. And unfortunately, the police are not trained to deal with unruly children, right? But for whatever reason, the situation is occurring. They then are called. They must then show up. And now they're put in a bad situation where they're interacting with a 10, 11, 12-year-old child. And all they've essentially been trained to do at the end of the day is put that child in handcuffs and remove them from the home. And what he talked about was we should not be put in that scenario. Someone with specific social service training, someone with mental health training, someone else should be showing up either with us or instead of us trying to address that situation. And I think ultimately when we start talking about public health, that's really the conversation that we need to begin transitioning to. So it's not a conversation of, okay, defund the police so that they're not able to do what's necessary, but it's rather fund them in an appropriate way, but also put resources into our social service, into our mental health, so that they're the ones addressing that child. And now we're not seeing on the news a child walking away and being put in handcuffs. I think that's the conversation that we need to be transitioning and need to be having as we move forward.
Chief, Chief and Powell, this is directly related to thinking around the new office and some of the moves made by the administration to start putting resources in this direction, no?
Yes, exactly. And I'll let Chief Powell talk more, but I think, the example that Councilman Lavelle gives is the kind of sole purpose that we are often looking for police to serve in a variety of means, in a variety of ways that they're not best skilled to serve. And when you have community disinvestment from a broad sense, not looking at anyone in particular, but community disinvestment, you may not have the same organizations or people on the ground that can act as intercessors into situations and communities in the ways that may be helpful. So for that example, instead of someone in a community being called to kind of relate to that young person because they know that young person, now the police are being called as a moment of fear, right? They're called and being brought in to compel this young person to go to school. And we know that's just not the makings of a healthy environment. And we know that over time, that young person that continues to have these interactions with the police based upon issues around not listening to their parents or not going to school has an outsized impact on how they engage with the criminal justice system and how they engage in institutions going forward. So the Office of Community Health and Safety is one model of saying we acknowledge that there are places that need to be, you need community facing people, community engaged folks with the proper training, folks with the access to services, and people who can help actually kind of rebuild the patchwork and the fabric of how community interacts with each other versus carceral systems or versus like calling in people who are not appropriate to call in to solve many of the situations we see, or that we also need people on the ground who are doing a lot of the great work and a lot of people doing a lot of the great work, which is why Councilman Burgess mentioned our partnership with the Hillman Family Foundations to invest more into Operation Better Block to complement some of the services that they do in thinking about race, public health, and kind of violence as a public health model, because we acknowledge that these things are time tested and they're real. Like the councilman said, we're just used to doing the same things, right? And so I think this time is a time for all of us to acknowledge that a lot of us are used to doing the same things, but we're getting the same results or on the edges. So now is the time to say, okay, you know what, maybe we need to do something really different, right? And for us, that is saying, okay, you know what, we know that from a public health perspective, we know that race is a huge factor in all the elements of public health. So if it's violence in the community, if it's violence with the police, if it's the outcomes of COVID based on the pre-existing conditions that are also part of the challenges that exist in the communities that Councilman Lavelle and Councilman Burgess are talking about, it all ties back up into the same challenge. It all ties back up into the structure of institutional structural racism that is perpetuated in systems often that we are all challenged by, right? And we sometimes unknowingly pass on. There are people who knowingly pass those systems on. So here is a time of reckoning where we have to have the conversations about things that before a lot of people were not having, and sometimes we were having in a much different kind of conversation. So I think what you see and what we all recognize and what we're all trying to move on as a practical model of then how things go to change, because we know these things, there's been a lot of books, there's a lot of people who get paid to talk about it, but also the key is from a municipal perspective, being closest to people, how do we unite and align ourselves with people who are thinking many of the same things to advance these things, and take a look at our institutions, look at our resource distribution, and look at our policy change in order to engage them all.
Thank you, Chief Powell. You've been involved in these discussions around what this office can look like and some of the structure. Can you walk us through some of the thinking there and some of the intent?
Yeah, absolutely. I think lifting up what others on this call have said, truly the idea, if you had to boil it down to a sentence, is that the first responder that comes to a crisis, whatever that may be, should be the right responder. And so we often rely on public safety to answer the crises of other systems that have failed. My colleague Laura Dragowski, who is our critical communities manager, talks about this often, where we as a society have leaned on public safety to answer issues within human services. If you're talking about problematic substance use, if you're talking about, to Chief Lane's point, an unruly child or truancy or issues within schools, if you're talking about mental health, oftentimes public safety is expected to respond to all of these different crises without the proper training and nuance to do so. So how do you shift from a model that goes from having officers respond who are trained again in the public safety lens to officers that are able to respond who've been trained as public health servants? So these would be our social workers, our community folks, our intake people, so that when something happens, we're not leaning on the criminal justice system and unduly putting people, and particularly Black people within the system. We're shifting to a model that's responsive and reflective of what that person needs. And so the idea of the Office of Community Health and Safety will be exactly that we're building an office that's able to revert away from officers and public safety officials being the ones to be first on the scene, to one where we're relying on community members, social workers, community caregivers to respond to the issues that our neighbors need.
I appreciate it. I mean, even in the example that Councilman Lavelle lifts up, I think it's such a great example, because you have this where a police officer is responding, but what if this was more of a family support responder, right? Or someone that was trained specifically to do the kinds of engagements and provide care, to that child or to that family. A couple things I'd like to lift up here, because while this is not a new conversation for government, is a lot of enthusiasm and movement around this now. There's a couple of ways or organizations where this is already kind of happening in a couple of the districts that are mentioned here on the call. So the group violence intervention work, which has been lifted up here, that everyone on this call has been involved with in some ways. These are community, they work with members of the community in the violence prevention, intervention space, and the prevention side of the spectrum that Reverend Burgess was mentioning. And they work with law enforcement, but they are the ones that respond and do the triaging. What used to be called Focus Pittsburgh, it is now, I believe, the Neighborhood Resilience Project in Councilman Lavelle's district, not only has an RV that responds to homicides throughout the county that assists with mental health first aid and does connections with broader services, but also now have community health deputies, which are deployed, or community residents are deployed in their community to do a number of services. And there are others too that we could point out. The future here is much closer than we think. In many cases, and the Center That Cares, Reverend Grayson as well, the group violence intervention work or related work. And what's cool about these experiences is not just that the community members are trained from the community, have the relationships in the community, have access to resources and services, so that when they're engaging with their own neighbors, that they're equipped for the job. They're also beginning to be paid. which I think is an important thing. And you talk about reintegration work. I mean, oftentimes it ends up being returned citizens themselves that have just the power of their testimony and are able to speak with power and truth and really divert activity in a way that leads for a better tomorrow. Council people and mayor's office colleagues, how do our separate teams work together in this season? What does it look like to cooperate? What does it look like to make good on all the enthusiasm and energy of this moment, but also get tactical from a policy and programmatic perspective to make sure that we're actually building a better tomorrow?
So let me use this as an opportunity to give you at least one example, something simple, right? So we've all talked about the group violence program. Everybody would agree it's effective, it's important, and it works. Yet, during the life of the program, we have funded it on nickels and dimes. Those outreach workers are not full-time. They have to work other jobs. So if we're serious now about that program and making it different and making life different for them, we pay an average police officer $100,000. It costs us about $100,000 per officer in terms of their benefits, their salaries, and all that stuff, right? We can pay these outreach workers probably closer to 40, 50,000, at least half of what their officers cost us. And so my challenge to us as a government, if we're serious about this work and we're serious that programs is the way to go, then the first investment we should do is to make these outreach workers full-time and to fund it at close to $1 million level that was called for 10 years ago when we first had this discussion, but there was never the appetite. But now that we're in this changeable moment, it should be, I think, the first thing we do. Because one of the things I am concerned about is that we put money back into the police department, that we find a way to say, okay, well, we want to, give more resources to programming, but let's embed the programming in the police department, right? Let's give the money to the police to hire the social workers. I don't think so. I think you need to put the money into community-based organizations that partner with the police to do that work. And that's going to be my challenge to the city, is that it should partner, because it takes a partnership to do this. Because the real way that you make the community safer is by making the community have confidence in the police and participate as partners. And one of the ways you do that is by investing in them. And so I think a way of doing this work is to prioritize fully funding the group violence initiative programs so that you can have full-time outreach workers, full-time counselors embedded in the program in order to make a difference and all the social services needed to make a difference in the life of that most at-risk, vulnerable population.
It's a great point, because what we're describing, even in the examples raised, are not one-time interventions. These are scenarios in which, ideally these folks that are themselves resourced, paid, and equipped for the job have the time. I remember when I worked at the Home of Children's Village, this idea of longitudinal impact. You want over 20 years, of impact. So the idea here isn't that you have a fleet of community health workers, family responders that do these one-off engagements, but rather that these are people with roots themselves that have the ability to build roots that can walk along with families and their own community over time and invest directly into their health. But those folks being invested in themselves, and not just with, as we used to say in the nonprofit money or from nonprofit space, play money as opposed to stay money. In this case, I think it's more on the stay money part of the spectrum. At least that's what the opportunity is, because ideally these are folks from the communities, the community mothers, the returned citizens, the public allies, the AmeriCorps, the folks that want to get involved in community, that have a sense of the importance of community-based organizations, that are getting the opportunity to add to their own skill set, add to their ability to make money and to thrive and be successful, by the way, but add also in their capacity to love on others and to spread out that good throughout the community. And Chief Majestic and Lindsay, what does it look like to work together in this season, and what has the relationship been like with council during this time?
So I think we've had a really open and good dialogue with the councilmen, both councilmen. Councilman Lavelle and Councilman Burgess have led around this idea of equity. They've led around the idea of racism as a public health issue. They've led around a lot of these things, and we've been in coordination with them as an Office of Equity to really think about program design and kind of structural design to move forward. I think you'll see a number of things around still the challenges with the COVID, with COVID, because I think it's important to look at, even in Pittsburgh, we may not have the disparities of a Philadelphia, a Detroit, a New Orleans, but we'll have the economic impacts of those places, right? Because COVID also, COVID really spoke to two challenges, not just the health challenges and the pre-existing conditions, AKA environments that are making Black people sick, but also the fact that, you know, last hired, first fired. The idea that you're working public facing jobs, the idea that you're working jobs that are closed down due to COVID, and the impacts of that. And while we have seen, you know, some of the support come through from the federal government and through the state to get people access to resources, we also do know that those resources will not be here forever, and those resources will eventually dry up. And we already know and understand that there's going to be a lot of challenges around evictions, and we're working with our housing authority and also working on a project around eviction innovation, along with magistrates and as well as large apartment complex holders and property owners to really think about what does this look like when the gates go open, if you will, around people who weren't able to pay their bills for the last couple months because of losing their jobs. So there's also that larger challenge of the economic health of people who have been impacted. And I think that the COVID Commission and what the task force will really speak to a lot of those challenges and paint the picture for a lot of the challenges and where people can fit in. Because again, like I'm saying, in systems thinking, we acknowledge that there are a lot of people that fit in at different times, right? Whether it's workforce, thinking about contact tracers, which I know Partner for Work and CCAC has been in contact with the Black electeds on talking about that conversation. Or we're talking about access to resources from the state, which I know the Black elected officials have been in conversations with the URA, Bridgeway Capital, and other folks. But it's really like a situation to really think about all these kind of things. You don't often get a space to talk about all the elements of health, right? The personal elements of health, the community elements of health, but also the economic elements of health. And all these things are part of the things that actually build up one's capacity to be able to be resilient, right? We know we often talk about Black people as resilient people who have survived through all these times, but we also know that when systems interlock to take away that resiliency, that compromises people, whether it's your actual compromise your system or compromise your economics. So I think you'll see a number of things that we're going to really be working on to try to think about how do we have the city to play a role that, you know, cities are having to step up and play in this time. The federal government is the federal government. But you know, you really see that people closest to these situations then have to really think about some of these solutions for how we move forward and how we be creative in this moment.
Thank you. Chief Powell, I have a question for you. We talk about this idea of cooperation between the mayor's office and city council, between the city council members, and in this moment, one of the reasons we're able to do that well is because there's a new policy shop within the mayor's office, made up of team members that have, in some cases, been around, but also there's been this intentional focus on putting this together. Could you speak to what that is and how you all function and how it lets you work with members of council, et cetera, on policy?
Absolutely. So this team, they're fantastic. They, again, largely work in the policy legislative space, but our purpose is really to ensure that when we're thinking about these ideas, when we're talking about these values and initiatives that we have, how can we drill down to make sure that they're A, actionable, and B, long-standing. The policy team, there are 5 of us on it, but what we do is we aid the managers within the Office of Equity and work closely with council and their staff to ensure that we're doing that deep dive. We have folks within the policy team that work, you know, largely at the state, federal level, at the local level, but the idea is to really look at best practices across the country, sometimes in the nation, and really figure out how to make it work for Pittsburgh. So if we're seeing this particular issue of council members raise, an interest or an issue, managers are working on something, how do we do that research and that kind of first wave of what's out there? What are the pitfalls of and unintended consequences of enacting a policy or supporting legislation like this? And then secondly, how do you get it done? This team is fueled by action, but also we've taken the second step of ensuring that when we do talk about policy, when we do make suggestions to managers and again, council folk, that we're talking about racial equity and really racial equity. Equity writ large is incredibly important, but if you're talking about back to Councilman Burgess's point about how a certain factor can dictate, your outcomes in life, in Pittsburgh, it's race. Largely aided by your zip code, but if you're talking about how one would maybe assume your ability to have economic success or educational success or workforce success, it's largely determined by race, no matter where you go. If you're talking about the other types of equity and justice initiatives that the mayor's office holds up, gender equity, LGBTQIA equity, if you add that additional lens of race, those particular people within that intersection are unduly burdened. So as we're talking about legislation, as we're talking about policy, as we're talking about how to make implementable strategies, we, within the policy shop, use that racial equity lens as our first lens and ensure that what we suggest, what comes out of it from there, is really trying to uplift that particular lens.
Thank you so much. All right, let's start to bring this conversation to a close. There's so much, expertise and history on the call. We could spend hours kind of unpacking all of it. But I'd like to bring the conversation back just to this moment that we're having for the council people. As Majestic points out, the realities around COVID, you have a health crisis, but also an economic crisis, and an economic crisis that is hit. But there's also what seems to be like a long tail, so to speak. We're going to be understanding what the economic impact is as time goes on. And now recently, the murders and the attention on police reform and just this racial moment that the world, quite frankly, seems to be having, but certainly that we're having here in Pittsburgh, is also something that people are paying attention to and participating in. So Councilman Burgess and Councilman Lavelle, what are you excited about the coming days and weeks? What gives you a sense of enthusiasm or a sense of joy in the midst of all of this strife? And then we'll bring it to some closing questions.
What excites me? So I think, and I don't know this to be a fact, but I'm pretty sure almost every day for the last 2 weeks, there's been a protest here in the city of Pittsburgh. And they've almost all been very peaceful, well-structured, well-organized. And I'm excited because who I see out there is not who I'm accustomed to seeing. I'm seeing new faces, new bodies. I'm seeing a multicultural, multi-ethnic group of citizens that are taking to our streets, calling for justice, demanding reforms that are so needed for the Black community that we've been saying are necessary for a very long time, but all of a sudden are have a new sound to them. Because sometimes what comes out of your mouth, although we're saying the same things, might get heard a little differently. And so that excites me. And I'm thankful for that. Because I think it's providing a space and opportunity for us to come together, us and the administration, to be able to come together to say, yes, we are in this moment where literally the world is watching what governments across this country do. And how we will respond to these crises and how we will respond to the demands being made upon us. And so I actually think, again, that we have this sort of wonderful opportunity for a lot of good to come out of a tragedy. And for us to begin really healing and putting all the necessary tools in place to really begin uplifting the Black community here in the city of Pittsburgh.
So let me give you a micro example that happened to me on Saturday. I was at the office at the church and working on my sermon, which is my Facebook presentation on Sunday morning, and I was there Saturday late afternoon. And so around our church, we have just built 58 new townhouses called Hamilton Kelly. And we have replaced what were empty lots, a parking lot, empty lots, and a huge empty lot that had once been a senior citizen center that the Housing Authority was going to rebuild but never did. That's been sitting there vacant for probably 20 years. And so I came down Kelly Street where all those new houses, the state-of-the-art houses with hardwood floors and islands and, you know, just great places to live now exist. And in a place that had been an empty lot for the last 20 years, half a block from my church, on Saturday, one of the residents had a big sign saying happy birthday. And I saw a little girl surrounded by other little girls. She was in a princess dress and she had on a tiara. And I'll cry if I talk about this too much. In a place that had been dangerous and desolate, these little girls are living in amenities that are first class of anything in our city. And they are dancing and being little girls. I was reminded of my own daughter, who's now 22, but she was that age. I remember her being in the princess dress, and it just reminded me of hope for Homewood, hope for those residents, that these kids will live in a completely different and have different opportunities. And so I cried a little bit at that moment, and every time I think about it, is that to me is the goal, that every child lives in clean, decent, affordable housing and has the access to the amenities and opportunities that are allowed them, and not have bad outcomes simply because they were born a certain color and born in a certain place. And so that gave me great joy, great joy. I've been thinking about it every day since then.
I appreciate that. And you two are two of the most involved council people when it comes to development. And you've mentioned this idea of mixed-use housing, and indeed, it was through my community-based work where being at community meetings in places like Homewood and Larmer, where I first heard residents talking about, hey, look, we can't affordable housing our way out of this crisis, and that's not what we want. We don't want just endless affordable housing. We want there to be a difference, and I don't come from that background, so I've been trying to learn more about the whys and wherefores. Is it possible to deliver on that dream that you mentioned with the little princess there, and long may she reign, without displacing people? Can the folks that say they want to be here in these communities, they want to be in Pittsburgh for this moment, they love where they live, can it be figured out so that they aren't forced to move if they don't want to?
Well, that's why if you heard me talk about the first step is that the residents themselves organize, like in Larmer, organize themselves and write their own community plan that the city adopts. Just like in Homewood, we've already written a community plan. Larmer has a community plan that the residents themselves have said, this is what we want, right? So that's number one. I think number two is the model is you build affordable housing first. So not only do you give the community the power to create their own vision for the future, that you build for those who are in the community first. The first money should go into building affordable housing and mixed income housing so that you have, and the last thing is that in many of our communities, like in Homewood, it's 60-70% vacant, 60% vacant. So there's enough land, right, to build new stuff without moving anybody. And when you do build new stuff, you build it for those residents who are already there. Again, you want to build communities of color for people of color, by people of color, in association with their allies and their partnerships. So that's kind of my vision, is rebuild communities of color for Black people, by Black people, with our allies and partners.
But all this, I think we also have to acknowledge, and I think Reverend Burgess has done that while we physically build up the community, we have to invest in the people themselves. Because we're only having an affordable housing conversation because people aren't making enough to be able to afford the rents, to afford the mortgages. And so if we're not directly investing in the people, if we're not helping Black businesses be established, if we're not helping people actually build those homes, if we're not putting people back to work, if we're not directing actual dollars and cents into these communities, then they will unfortunately be displaced because they won't be able to benefit from the economic development happening around them. And so I just think as we have this sort of policy conversation, we also need to be very frank that there's what we write and then there's what we do with our actual budget. And the budget must reflect the intent of the policy. And unfortunately, that is not an easy conversation to have in this city, right? It is not an easy conversation to simply say, we need to be very intentional in directing actual dollars that are historically have always gone to these 5 communities, that they now need to go and directly building up the people who live in Homewood, the people who live in Larimer, the people who live in these underserved communities. And so that's going to be a very interesting conversation that we're going to have, and we're going to have it publicly, obviously. And it's also interesting because you mentioned this pandemic, and unfortunately, the city is not going to have as much financial resources at our disposal as we've had previously. And so how are we to take limited resources and give them to those most in need is going to be off-putting and offsetting to, I would bet, many of my colleagues, right? And so we just have to be honest about this, and we will need to have that conversation, but we just need to be very intentional that building the buildings is great, but if we're not investing in the people, it's all for naught.
Chief Powell, any thoughts there?
No, I mean, absolutely agree. To the point about how do we, like what's next? Frankly, Black people are tired. Like this is not, a conversation that's new to any of us. If we're talking about access to wealth and capital, access to housing in opportunity-rich neighborhoods, if you're talking about equal access to education opportunities, like this is all stuff that both Councilman and Chief Lane have been working on for quite some time. Going back to the initial point about where policy meets politics, we're at a really critical time now where it feels like the public conversation is shifting as well, where when we're talking about racial equity, when we're talking about not communities of color, but Black communities, we're seeing more people across the city want to engage in this conversation, that want to really unpackage and talk about what it means to be a city for all and how do we move towards real equity. And so if we're talking about what I'm excited about, again, cautiously, because that's my nature, if we're talking about what we're excited about, it's that commitment to Black communities, that commitment to real change, that commitment to equity. And to the point of how we do that, it's council, the mayor's office, and the administration putting together policy and a budget that reflects exactly that. And so, while we're elated to have these conversations with the councilmen, there are so many others that need to be at the table across the city to make sure that that vision comes to bear.
And Chief Lane, I'd be curious on who you think comprises that larger table. I've heard you discuss these issues in a philanthropic sense, in a community-based organization and development sense, and in a policy sense. Who are the stakeholders that we're referring to, and what are your thoughts there?
Well, I think it goes back to this idea of everyone is playing their part, but knowing that systems interlock to keep people in situations of harm. So systems have to interlock to keep people in a situation. So one of the challenges, and Pittsburgh, when it chooses to, does this very well, is come together to figure out what is the bigger goal, and then what is everyone doing towards the end of that goal. What we often find is individuals are working in their silos to do their thing. So if philanthropy is advancing what they think about from their vision, from their board, or if the county is advancing what they think about from their vision, if our corporate leadership is advancing what they think about from their vision, if we're advancing what we think about from our vision, all these things are good, But the question is there a pathway? The question is there a connection? Is there that network that from the time a person thinks about trying to get opportunity, that we've created spaces for that opportunity to bloom? Or are the opportunities there, which in some senses they are, but they're disjointed? Are the opportunities there, but they're not at scale to what Reverend talked about? If someone wants to develop their physical home, are there resources? And that's a conversation in itself, right? So we've been doing a lot of work around a roofs-a-thon and really putting roofs, and a fundamental element of putting roofs back on the homes of people who own their homes, because we acknowledge that sometimes that cost is a huge cost. And especially in this time now, something like your roof going bad is something that then has an impact on your ability to sell your house. It has an ability for you to get refinanced, right? So these are kind of my example of the system. So you are in alignment with UPMC and some other folks, which is an example of a good private-public partnership, there's been some money to make sure people can put roofs on their homes in order to help them with the quality of that. But that's just an example of saying, like, the systems have to interlock, the interests have to interlock, right? It's necessary but insufficient for everyone to do what they're doing separate. Because what you'll find is you'll see a whole bunch of individual activities that don't get us to what we're talking about collectively. What we're talking about, when people see an enhanced quality of life, you know it when you see it. We'll create metrics. We can talk about all those kind of things. But fundamentally, people know when they see opportunity. They know when they see the ability to go to their employment center and be able to find a job, or the access to get to CCAC and get an education, or the access to go to Pitt, or the access to resources. People know what that looks like, right? And so we have to be thoughtful in saying, all the different institutions are thinking about this. What does this look like, right? What does this grand picture really look like? And how do we get there once we acknowledge what it looks like? So it's one of those things that we have to build physical capital, but we have to build human capital, right? Just examples of what Councilman Burgess and Councilman LaBelle talked about. We have to build both of them, right? And we have to be acknowledging that the development of human capital, development of brick and mortar, they go along with each other. They are totally aligned. They have to be aligned, because again, in healthy systems, those are aligned, right? So, but if they're not aligned in our system, then it's not going to be healthy. If you're saying do this stuff over here, but don't do this, right? Solve the violence problem, but don't solve the job problem. It's not going to work, because if you're not working on solving the job problem, the violence problem will always be there, right? So it's really for us now, the challenge, I think, is how do we get out of the silos? And that means that everyone's in charge, aka no one's in charge, right? And acknowledging and being okay with what that looks like in real time. And Pittsburgh has done it when we've chosen to. So it's really now about the collective will to be able to work together to break down those silos for the benefit of not just all the Black residents in the city, of every resident in the city. Because to be clear, if Black people are doing good, everyone's going to do better, right? That is not there's the moral component of this, and there's the actual economic component of this, which says if you want to make the city better, if you want more money in the city, more opportunities, a place where people want to be, then it makes sense to invest in making sure that the quality of life is higher.
It's a great point. We've seen it in different sectors and in different spaces, systems conspiring to harm or conspiring to maintain disadvantage. We've seen that in the housing sense. We can see that in examples, perhaps in law enforcement, in development and things along these lines. And then the question then becomes, can these systems and others conspire for the good? And I think the answer is yes. I think we've actually mentioned some examples of where that's been the case, both historically and recently here in Pittsburgh. But then to your point, Chief Lane, what does it really look like to have a community conversations where those silos are suspended? And we get down to talking about what we're all finally talking about, which is the benefit of folks that are living here in this community and in this city. And as the testimony of the council people will attest, once you start getting down to the neighborhood level, it starts being a relatively small number of people. And there's an ability for leaders to engage directly with residents, for residents to make their voices heard, and examples for each of those folks or levels on best practices. What can work, what's worked in other neighborhoods, what you can then do to organize to make your voices heard, and how folks can move things towards progress. And I am, quite frankly, feeling relatively encouraged. It's been an emotional roller coaster in a lot of ways. I've really enjoyed these conversations because I get to hear about so many good things that are happening. But every which way I look, I hear corporate entities, government entities, organizations speaking out. And in many cases, specifically naming racism and specifically putting their chips on the table to say, here's what we're willing to commit to seeing a better tomorrow. I'd like to just bring the conversation to a close with just some final encouragements. What you all would say as Black people, to Black people, and just the folks that might be watching in terms of their own progress in lives right now. What would you like them to know about City Council or just about your own leadership? And how would you encourage them to navigate? Councilman Lavelle, let's start with you, sir.
I would encourage them to stay engaged however best they can. I think Director Lane mentioned it when we sort of all work in our silos, but we all have important jobs in whatever that silo may be. And I would just encourage them to stay encouraged, to keep pressing on. As relates specific to council, I would encourage them to hold us accountable, to call us, to email us, both myself, Reverend Burgess, but not just us, but our colleagues as well. They also need to hear what message is being asked from the Black community, but work to hold us accountable, and we will do our best. And it's certainly my intent. I believe it's Reverend Burgess' intent, and I believe it's the intent of the administration that we are going to do our absolute best to uplift and rebuild and create a very strong and thriving African-American community.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
So we do want, we want those who make sure that you're staying safe, that you're social distancing, that even though we are going green, there's still a problem. In particular, those who are African-American and over 70, you're the highest risk, and so you should take even greater precautions. So that's number one. Number two, you can call us. You have my phone number, 412-255-2137. You can call. We are still answering those phones, and if there's a need that you have, we will try to meet your need. Third of all, let's look at moving forward together to do the things that we chatted about, which is creating a community plan in all of our communities of color and make them communities of choice. And so when we get together and plan our communities, then I believe that you will have the vision, the plan of how to move forward. And then lastly, we need to come together as a Black community around plans for a specific community and make it a priority. I think that when you say you want to help Black people as a whole, that's true, but I think the best way you start that process is by helping Black people who live in Black communities. And I think that should be the focus of our work. And it is twofold. It's investing in people and investing in place. So investing in Black people in Black places. I'll say it last, but again, building Black communities for Black people, by Black people, with our partners and our allies.
Thank you, sir. Chief Lane.
I think I would say, I think where we're at, be encouraged that people have brought issues to the table that have not been discussed in this way, right? We are having new conversations. Well, we're having old conversations in new ways. Let me say that. We're having conversations that we've been having, but we're having them that is allowing us to have a broader dialogue. For those who are interested in what that broader dialogue looks at, stay involved, look at how these systems are intertwined and work together. But know that you are heard, through a lot of this. Obviously, people often will think, go ahead and change it and it'll change. However, I heard a term last night on a show that white supremacy is a long-term project, right? And so, while it may shift, it's a long-term concept, right? So we have to really think about the long-term as well. And while we're engaged in the short-term to move things, stay involved in the long-term and stay, again, collaborating, coming together, and acknowledging what are the shared vision and the shared interest and the shared intent of making sure that the quality of life for Black people here improves, and it is amongst the best in the city and in the world. It's not because it's not just enough to say, look what we just did. And that's on us too. It's not just enough to say, here's this money or here's this thing. It's really about, are you better off? And if you're not better off, then it's not working. If you're better off, then it's working, right? And that's what we need to hold ourselves to, and that's what we need all the citizens of our city and people who love the city and love humanity to hold us to and hold themselves to.
Thank you, sir. Chief Lane, or Powell.
I mean, I just would quickly want to add to the point of the longevity of these conversations is, you know, as we move to 2021 and 2022 and onward, that we continue to center our Black neighbors and Black community. If we're talking about equity, if we're talking about justice, it's centered in ensuring that neighbors that haven't been a part of these conversations, haven't been at the table, haven't been able to invest directly into their neighborhoods and communities are at the forefront of our thoughts and our processes when we're talking about policy, we're talking about legislation, we're talking about the budget. We have an opportunity here to ensure that these conversations, again, centering Black communities, don't just end here, that, you know, they don't just end with police reform, that to several points made throughout this conversation, that we're thinking again about the ways that systematically Black residents, Black neighbors have been held back and held to different standards. And that when we build, when we move forward as a city, that we're thinking again about those residents, lifting up their voices and centering their issues and concerns with what we do.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you, each of you, for your time to unpack some of these important ideas, share a little bit about your own testimony and work. It's greatly appreciated. I also want to acknowledge there are two ASL interpreters that have been along for the ride. Thank you all. You know, folks, we don't all often have talking points for these conversations. We try to let them be as organic as possible and honor the history and the track records of the folks that join us. And that's not always the easiest thing for folks that are offering their services to help interpret. So we just want to say thank you to Nicholas and Logan today for their work. A little bit of a thank you and good job. And please keep tuned with the mayor's office here. We're going to continue to have these conversations and unpack these ideas. And I hope that you feel encouraged having heard this conversation, because there are leaders in this region that are not only listening, but they're active and they're engaging. And I think if you look at the examples raised, there's a lot of really encouraging things to take a look at and ways to move forward together. Reverend Burgess, I saw my dad yesterday for Father's Day, and we had a nice meal. I know you know each other well. And we were talking about the story that you'll be familiar with, which is one where there's two friends walk past a man that's experiencing homelessness. And the man that's experiencing homelessness asks them for alms, asks them for money. And there's this moment where they say in response, you know, silver and gold have I not, but what I have I give unto you. And it ends up being a transformational event for that person that's experiencing homelessness. And we were talking about this idea of this story as people being willing to give what they have, to put their chips on the table and to say, look, I may not have this expertise, I may not have this institutional power, but what I have here. And being willing to do that can make all the difference. And I think that is really what we're talking about with this conversation. Folks in different lanes, you know, people in city council, people in the mayor's office, people in policy, people in philanthropy, people in community, all having this conversation, all paying attention and saying, well, I'm willing to put what I have on the table. And if we believe in that, and we speak with a common language about what we want, nothing's going to be withheld from us. And so thank you to each of you for the work that you do. And then to all that are watching, please take the very best care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.